Hi everyone. So hope you guys are doing good. Okay, so let's wait for a few more minutes, then we can start. Yeah, hi Lokesh. Hi Abhijit. Hi Watan. Okay, so I guess we can start. I am audible, right? Just can you put some comments? Like, am I audible correctly, or is there any noise or something like that? Hi. What about the project location? So currently, first we are going through the basics, then we are taking on the project when we are moving forward with the React part. Cherry, any plan for Monstack Live? Yeah, surely. First we are going to this session, then if we can plan on doing the Monstack Live as well. Okay, so yeah, we can start with the session. Hi Rajesh, good evening. Okay, so yesterday we had a session on HTML. So the guy who haven't watched it can watch it. So whenever we talk about the web development process, there are main three aspects, that is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So yesterday we have covered the HTML part, which is just a markup language for describing the layout. Today we are going to talk about the cascading style sheets and going to look a few of the properties and the concepts that are very important for the CSS purposes, for styling purposes, right? Okay, so yeah, we can get started with the session. Okay, so these are the topics that we are going to cover in this session. There's about CSS, the syntax, CSS object model, like how we can include the CSS in the document, the selectors, there are multiple kind of selectors, CSS box model, and a few of the CSS properties. All right. Okay. So let's start with our topic, which is about CSS. Okay. So first of all, what is CSS? CSS stands for the Cascading Style Sheets, and it is basically a style sheet language for the presentation, for describing the presentation of the documents returning either HTML or XHTML or XML, which is basically in the markup languages, right? Now, it describes how elements are to be displayed in the application, in the browser, or in any media based on the properties. All right. So let me zoom in a bit more. I guess it's visible now. Yeah. So CSS basically separates the presentation and the content part, because we have talked about the HTML. Okay. So HTML was never intended to basically contain the formatting. Basically, it is just a markup language. So let's say in like in HTML 3.2, I guess in HTML 3.2 specifications, we have the font tag, which contains the color attribute. So let's say if you want to, if you have multiple pages and you have to define the color and the formatting for each and every content, it would be a lot more hectic, right? So CSS, a W3C created CSS, which saves a lot of work and time, and we can even uh, format multiple documents all at once based on the properties we have. Now the MIME type, like the content type, which is in the headers, is text and CS, text oblique CSS, and the latest version we are using is CSS3, and the external CSS files, which we are going to talk about in the upcoming slides, has an extension of .css. All right. So yesterday we had an example of sofa. The inner structure is made out of wood, right? The structure is there, right? Now, if we want to give it more proper styling, we add cushion, multiple layers, so it will be like more interactive, like more comfortable, right? So similar things with the HTML. So let's consider like this is the page. I have included the CSS file in this. So let's say if there is no CSS file in this, so how would it look? Let's do that. So this is the it's about CSS file, right? So let's hide the CSS file. So this is how it looks if I don't have any CSS file present in this particular document. Though it's still readable, but when we formatted the format, if the formatting is present, it looks a lot more better and readable, right? So let's include it again. Okay, great. Okay, so moving forward, the CSS syntax. Okay, so the CSS syntax is quite simple, and it more like the properties that CSS have is basically based on the English keywords, most of them, which are descriptive enough, like which property indicates which, right? Now CSS is based on some rules. It is a rule-based language, which consists one or more selectors and a declaration block, which comprises CSS properties, and selectors can be class, ID, attributes, tag names. We are going to talk about the selectors in the upcoming slide. Now, the selectors basically the class and ID selector are case sensitive because classes and IDs are those which we provide to our HTML elements as an attribute, right? And it can contain hyphen and underscores, but always starts with a character. It cannot start with any digit. And tag names are not case sensitive. We can put it in the capital letters as well. Now the declaration block starts with parentheses like these, and it can contain multiple key value pair, which is separated by the semicolon, and multiple key value pairs, which is separated by the colon. So we can have multiple properties and selectors. So we can even group multiple selectors by the comma. So let's define some. So let's create a file for that. Okay. So we have a div, and we have some dummy text here. So currently, I'm defining in the internal CSS. So this is my selector. Div tag is my selector. And let's say I want to give it a property of color red, right? So if I go there, I can see, right, that I have the selector I have, like this selector is pointing to this division element, and I have put the CSS property which is color red. Now if I have to declare another property that is, let's say, background color, I can put a yellow. Okay, and a padding of 10 pixels. So yeah, now like it does have a background color yellow and some padding, right? So what if, let's say, if I don't give this semicolon, it basically does not give any background because this is an invalid syntax. Though I have the property of color red because like the browser does some intelligent work and produces like whatever there is whenever there is an invalid syntax, so the browser just ignores it. We can confirm it. by, let's say, we have this division element, right? So if we see the color red is there, but the background color is not there because we have missed the semicolon part, right? Okay, no, it is fine, right? Okay, so we are going to talk about the selectors much more. Yeah, hi Ritik. SAS also comes under CSS. Uh, kind of whether, well, it is not SASS. It is not SAAS. It is SASS. SAS. Okay. So we have talked about the basic syntax. So moving forward, yeah, the CSS object model, right? Okay, so yesterday we talked about the document object model. Now the document object model is for the HTML. Similarly, um, whenever the HTML document is being rendered by the browser, a different representation of that HTML document is being created. That is DOM, right? Similarly, whenever the browser is parsing the HTML, whenever it encounters the style tag or any sort of CSS, so it creates a CSS object model, which is local, which is the object model like DOM. It is a similar representation. It just contains the CSS properties as well. So whenever both are created, whenever both of these object model are created, these models are being combined, then a rendered tree is being formed. Now this rendered tree is basically the object which we visually see in our browsers. So let's say we have head. Okay, so all the head properties are not visually represented in the browser, right? It contains the metadata, whether body contains all the content, right? So let's say in this CSSOM object model, we have given body a font size of 16 pixels, paragraph of 16 pixel, font weight bold. So it is combined with the DOM, and the final final tree, that is render tree, is being created, which is in turn rendered on the browser. And basically, why we require CSSOM? So that the JavaScript can make use of those objects to manipulate the CSS and add maybe some dynamic styling based on the operations we want to perform, right? Okay. So far, any questions? Okay. So moving to our next topic, that is how we can add HTML in our document or add CSS in our HTML document. Now there are three ways by which we can add. First is external CSS, second is internal, and third is inline. Now let's look at those. So let's say I have given some CSS. I've created this file, right? So if I have to, let's say, define a division tag, I have some dummy text. Let's define it some styles. Okay. So now this is the example of the inline CSS. We have given this particular div tag the inline CSS, and this div tag we have given it the internal CSS. Though this CSS, the internal CSS, will be applied to both of the div tag, but it totally depends on the cascading order, which we are going to talk about in a moment. And let's define CSS file also. Let's say we are defining playground.css. Right. Now to include this file, we need to make use of the link tag, which basically defines the relationship between the external resource and the related to the current document. So I have defined it. So I'm including the playground.css, right? So if I say, and let's define a div tag, color of this. So let's save it. See how our documents look. So this is the internal styling, this is the inline styling, and this is, I have linked the external CSS, right? Okay, so let's look at what the result is. Okay, so our first div tag has color blue and background yellow. Let's put a separator here. Background yellow and color blue, background red, sorry, background yellow and color red, right? Okay, now why is it so? Like we have defined some, like this is the div tag, why it is not applied to this particular div tag? Because the inline CSS has much more priority than the internal CSS, and the external CSS has less priority than the internal CSS. So if I have to put it, so it is like the internal, oh sorry, inline CSS has more priority than internal, which has much more priority than external CSS. Right. Okay. So in CSS, like the cascading style sheets, right? So why does the cascading word is needed? Why not just style sheets or HTML style sheets, markup style sheets? Because when I like cascading is a word, it's when all the where all of your CSS is compiled into a new virtual style sheet basically. So whenever the page is loaded, the browser detects all of the CSS and creates a new virtual style sheet. So it may happen, let's say you have 10 tens of 100 of pages in your application, right? So there may be times when you have defined a selector which indicates or applies to multiple elements basically, right? So this is one of the example. Okay. So we have defined internal CSS here, this div. So we have multiple div elements here, right? So it is being applied to all the elements, but the priority is given to the inline because of the cascading. Like the weight is given to those particular properties. Like on the runtime, the weight is given to every property. So let's say I have this, right, but if I give it a important rule, this is basically a rule, CSS rule of important. Let's say if I have defined this, what do you think like the color will be of this particular? It will be overridden by this, I guess. You see, like initially it was blue. Let's remove the important property here. It is red, right? Now, even if like the inline CSS has much more priority over the internal, but it still overrides it because of this particular rule. So we should like make minimal use of this particular rule because it can create a lot of headache like when you are interacting with a lot of elements when you have a production ready application, right? And similarly, like the inline CSS should also be used at minimal because let's say if you have a lot of content in your website and if you are providing the inline CSS for every each and every element, then it will be very, you know, create a headache for the developers to maintain and give styling to each and every element. So it is preferable to use the external CSS because it is easy to maintain and it keeps your the presentation part and the content part separate. So okay, so let's say we have this, right? Let's similarly with do this in this. What do you think the color will be? Let's make it a different color. I guess it's still going to be red because internal CSS has much more priority than external CSS. But if I tweak some of the selectors, let's say I give it a class of maybe div, right? So if I change the specificity is basically how specific you are while defining the rules. So let's say I have multiple rules corresponding to the same element, but I am specific in a particular rule. Let's say dot div. This is the selector, the tag name, and this is the class I have given. So I guess div.div is more specific if I compare it to the div selector, right? If I say, now what do you think? Let's give it a color of Wait. If we see, right, because we have given a much more specific selector here, right? Okay, so overall, like cascading depends on three things: the source order, like what is your source, like either it can be inline, or it can be internal, or it can be external. But let's say, and the second thing is, which is specificity, like how specific you are while defining the rules. Like while giving the specificity, the browser give weight to each and every rule. So by weightage, like it does some default computations, and if there is an important important rule present, then it overrides all of this and then check for the specificity. And let's say if I have rules in, like same rule with different properties. Let's give it a color of orange, different background, maybe green, right? So what do you think, like because both of these are exactly same, just different properties. So I guess let's see. Yeah. So here, last one wins the race, basically, because like it overrides all of the properties given by this particular declaration and the selector, right? So let's say if I define this same in the internal CSS, let's give it a color of blue. Will we see? Now the much more priority is given to the internal CSS, though like it contains the important rule, but still like the internal CSS has much more priority, and the specificity is same in all of the cases: div.div, div.dit, div.dit, right? So this is about the cascading and the specificity we provide to the selectors. Okay. So I guess so far any questions? HTML and CSS, you can do it. No, like, but there are certain aspects of CSS which can create a lot of headache while you are implementing this, right? Okay, so moving forward with the next slide. Okay, so the CSS selectors. So we have seen some of the selectors. So selectors is basically points to the element you want to style. It can be tag name, class, or ID, or even an attribute based on the which is present on the element itself. Now multiple selectors can share same declaration. So let's say if we have, so let's remove all of this. So now we know like what is internal, external, and inline CSS. So we'll be making use of much of the external and the internal CSS. Okay. So let's define a div tag and a paragraph tag. It contains some dummy text, right? And in our CSS, div p. Now we see like the div tag contains a p tag for every p tag which is inside the div. So this is a kind of combinators, like a universal ID class tags are, quite descriptive enough, right? But these are the special type of selectors which we are going to talk about, the combinators. So the combinators are basically specifies the relation with respect to the combination used as a selector. So let's say we have a parent and we have multiple childs, or even a parent can have multiple siblings, right? So that's what combination means. So let's say we have this. So let's say we have another div tag which contains some, right? So for, so let's define one more. Okay, so this is div p. For every div for every descendant, the division element have. So let's give it a color of red and a background color of yellow. Let's see. right? Now, as you can see, like for every division, for every paragraph tag that is inside the div tag, for every descendant, basically, right? So another div tag, another combination can be this one. So just the next descendant. So let's say we have a section here which also have some content, right? Now this paragraph tag is not the direct descendant of this particular div tag. It is the direct descendant of this section tag, right? So if we save, let's give it a color of maybe yellow, background color red, I guess. Now you see the direct descendant, like for all the descendants, we have defined the color red and the background color yellow, right? This is one of the case. And for the direct descendant, like not the nested one, the direct descendant, we have specified the color yellow and the background color red, which is this one, right? Okay, so we have some, let's say, the sibling selector. Now the div, just the next sibling of this div tag. For every div, like if we have two divs side by side, we have this div tag. Let's remove this horizontal tag. We have this div tag. So this specifies the relationship of siblings, right? So it is hidden by the this red background. So let's give it a padding of 20 pixels. Now we see that the parent element, that is div, is having the background color and some padding here, right? Okay, so like various type of combinations can be made based on your requirement and the type of relationship you want to specify, right? And the universal selector is this. So the universal selector has been much more less priority than the class ID and the attribute color of yellow, black, I guess. So it does not put any effect, right? But if we hide all of this and just give it a of maybe red, so it will put all the element. The color of all the elements is red, right? Okay, so let's talk about different kind of selectors. Okay, so the attribute based. So every element can have attributes, certain attributes, which basically provides additional information, right? So we can even apply the CSS based on those attributes, right? So let's do a section which may have an attribute, let's say data show, right? Let's give it a value of true in some dummy text, right? So let's so let's give it a background color of maybe yellow and color of so for specifying the attribute, we have to use uh, these braces and the attribute name. Okay, so if you don't provide any value, yes, it will still work, right? It is still working. Let's define a horizontal tag here. Still working, right? But if you want to be more specific, you can even provide the value it has, right? It is still working because we have provided the value which is being rendered in this particular element. So let's give another value and see. As you see, like no CSS has been applied because this rule does not matches this particular element, right? So this is the type of attributes you can use, and the pseudo classes and pseudo elements. These are quite interesting because like the pseudo classes are used to style elements based on their state, and whereas the pseudo elements are used to style specified parts. specified parts of an element based on the selected type. So let's take up some pseudo classes first. Okay, so let's define this. Okay, so we have a div tag which contains my link. Okay, so let's say I have a div tag which contains anchor tag, and anchor tag has some background color of yellow and padding of maybe 10 pixels, 20 pixels, and color of teal, and okay, let's go with the black color. Right, and display inline block. Okay, now based on the pseudo classes we are talking about, so let's say whenever link is active, and even focus. So there are some kind of certain states which element pauses, like whenever, let's say I have this navigation link, right? Whenever I put my cursor on it, it means hover. When I click on it, it comes into two states, that is active and focus, right? So let's make it hover. Okay. So when it is hovered, I want the background color to be maybe white, maybe yeah, white. Let's consider it white. Give it a border of 1 pixel, solid red. Right. Let's define the active rule above hover. We want the background color to be blue whenever it is active, right? So when I see this, okay. So now if you see, like when I hover on this link, the background color changes because I have this particular state, some kind of CSS based on my requirement, right? And when I click, there is no active CSS applied to it because of the order I have specified here. So I have specified the active state before the hover. But for that to work, I need to specify it below the hover state so that it can work. So let's say now we have this. Now when I click on this, now you see the background color is blue because of the order it also changes, right? So I can have multiple states. Let's say one more state, that is focus. Okay, so let's consider the background color to be salmon, I guess. Right. Now if we see, if I click on this, now I'm not able to see my focus class, right? Now I can see because the element is in focus, even though I have removed my cursor, but the element is in focus. That's why, right? So these are some kind of pseudo classes which we have talked about. So there are multiple pseudo classes which we can style based on the certain states of the element, right? Now we can look into the pseudo elements. So pseudo elements basically, style the specified parts. So let's say if we want to put some content before, we want to put some content after, or even in the first word or the first line, we can do that by using the pseudo elements selectors. Okay, so let's say div a before. Okay, so if I want to use the before pseudo element, right, and I want to have the content of, let's say, my pseudo element, right? Now you see the difference. Now my pseudo element here is appended. Now we want to see in the browser directly. Now you see the anchor tag has this particular before pseudo element, right? And the content is my pseudo element. We can change it directly from here, even like for the debugging purposes, browser gives us this powerful functionality so that we can directly manipulate. We don't have to go every time to the editor and change the certain properties to see like how does it look, how does it make differences to our code, right? We can do directly from here. Let's say here I want to remove the border, I want to remove the display, right? By default, the anchor tag is inline. So for the like margin and padding, I have given a display of inline block, right? So let's take another pseudo element property that is after, right? After you see my pseudo element, my link after, so it is appended after. Now this is my text. Now this is before state. This is after state. So it does help like in certain cases. Let's say if I want to put some, okay, so let's consider we have this right now. These external link icon that I have put here, these are all basically the after. I have used the after pseudo element here. So for every anchor tag, so let's say if I have to reduce my markup or reduce my markup language, so it kind of gives me the basically provides me some ease, right? So I have defined the after here, the after pseudo element, and I have given it the empty content and some kind of styling so that I can have this external link icon, right? Okay. Now we were at how to include here. Okay, so these are some of the pseudo elements we have talked about. There are multiple pseudo elements, that is first line, the first word even, right? So we have like multiple combination of selectors. It's just totally depend which element you want to select in in your HTML document. So based on that, the styling will be given, right? And if it's there may be chances like you have defined multiple rules. So the rules based on the specification and the weightage will be applied. All right. So I guess we have covered many of the selectors here. So if you guys have any sort of question based on the selectors. Pseudo class after before. Yeah, Aditya. Okay. Okay, so let's move forward. Okay, so the CSS box model. Now the CSS box model is quite interesting because many of the CSS frameworks does this by default. Right. Now in every CSS, everything in CSS is wrapped around basically a box so that we can even change the layout. We can control the layout for controlling the layout and creating the structure basically. Now, what is box model? Now it defines how different part of a box work together. Now a box can have margin, padding, even the border and the content, right? Now to set the width and height of any box correctly, we need to understand how box model works. So there are two kinds of box model: a standard one and the alternate one. Many of the CSS frameworks like Bootstrap or even if we talk about the Velma, they all make use of the alternate box model. So let's see what is the difference between these two box model and how does it affect. Okay, so let's create another file. Okay, so let's define a div tag contains a paragraph tag which contains some content. Okay, well, so let's keep it empty for better understanding. I've defined a style tag, right? And it's a border of 1 pixel, black. We are going to talk about these CSS properties like border, margin, padding later on. Now, the p tag, let's give it a width of maybe 200 pixels, height of 200 pixels, border of maybe 1 pixel, solid black, red. Okay, so now we see. Okay, so first of all, it takes up the complete width, right? So let's define it as we display inline block. So it just takes the width as much as it's required, right? Okay, so now let's give this p a padding of 20 pixels, margin of 20 pixels. Okay, so now we see we have some padding, we have some margin here and some padding, right? So if we look at the CSS, now we see when we hover on this, we see the width is 242 and the height is also 242, right? But we have defined the width of 200 by 200 here. So why does it taking visualizing as 242 pixels, right? Because it is also taking the padding and the border into the account, because the border here is 1 pixel, the border here is 1 pixel, and we have given the padding of 20 pixel. So 20 pixel, 20 pixel, 40 pixel, and 2 pixel of the border. So 42 pixel in addition with the 200 pixels. So the overall width is 242 pixels, right? So this is the standard box model that we use. Now let's say if I want to use a alternate box model, right? So let's give it a class of alternate. Same styling. Now the alternate containing the p tag, I want to give it box sizing of border box. Okay, so now you see like same CSS has been applied to both of these. The difference here is just I have defined the box sizing for this, which is border box. So what does what's happening here? So let's see the width again. So now if you see the box size is 200 by 200. Now it is not taking that padding and the border into the account. Instead, it reduces the content area, because a box has a content box and the border box and padding box and the margin box. Though margin does affect, it does not, like the box sizing does not affect the margin, though it affects our overall layout. Now, if the box sizing is not given, our box is something like this, because it is taking into the account the padding as well, right? So it is the benefit of using the box model. So alternatively, we are using the alternate box model. So we define this in the universal selector, so that all the boxes which we are going to use and create using the CSS has this property of box sizing border box, so that the content area is included in the width and height itself, along with the margin and the borders. Okay, so just remove this. Now I guess all of this are going to have, like, both of the boxes are now same, because we have used the universal selector here. Now you see the universal selector here, right? Okay, so this is about the box model, right? Okay, so moving forward. Okay, so the interesting part, the CSS properties. So we have multiple different CSS properties based on which you can actually, you know, change the layout, define some, declare the positions, display, like how should it display, how should the text be formatted, font formatting and all. So we are going to look all the properties one by one specified here. Okay, so let's create another file. I'm using the internal CSS here because like it is very easy to show you guys. Otherwise, the external CSS is much more preferred. Okay, so let's look at the color property. So color is like a descriptive enough. We want to give colors to particular elements, right? So let's say if we have p tag containing some dummy text, I want the p tag to have color of maybe blue, right? Now this p tag has color blue. It also depends on the selectors in the specificity, right? So we can have color for different properties. So let's say if we give color to the body property. So here comes the inheritance part because like I have not defined any color to this p tag. Instead, I defined the color to the body tag. So the color is inherited from the body. So let's say if I don't want to inherit anything, so we can define the color to be unset. Or sorry, the initial one, I guess. The initial value is taken from the body tag itself, right? But like unsetting it, make it to the default settings, which is the body tag. But the initially the color is rendered as black, right? Okay, and if I remove this property, it will take the color as blue based on the inheritance. Okay, so the second property is border. Okay, so let's get. Okay, so border has basically three things. That is, first is border width, like how much width you want to give to a particular element, let's say 2 pixels. The border style, the kind of style, whether it should be a solid line, it should be dotted, or it should be hidden or inset outside ridge, solid. So it totally depends on the requirement. So let's give it a solid and the border color. Border color, let's say I want to put the green, right? So if you see, it is rendered accordingly. Now for the shorthand of this, we can just define the border property, give it a width of 2 pixels and the border style, then the border color. It behaves just the same as all these three properties we have defined. So when you like get hands-on experience, you will be using these three like these shortened properties because it is much easy to use these properties, right? Okay, so let's move forward with the next property, the margin and the padding. Okay, so margin is basically okay. Okay, so the margin is the clear space outside the border, basically. Okay, so if we have to visually see it, let's say we have defined a div tag inside p tag and have this. Okay, a horizontal tag here for the separation. Let's give it a margin first. Margin of 20 pixels. Okay, and let's give div tag a border of 1 pixel. What is black? So now you see there is some space. Let's increase the space. You see like in the div tag I have given the p tag a margin of 50 pixels and the border of p tag is this, right? So the margin basically provides the create space around the border. It does not include the border in the content box itself. Instead create the space outside the borders, whereas padding includes the border in the border box itself. So I have given it the padding of 20 pixels, right? So it is included inside the borders. So that is the difference between the margin and the padding, right? So these are the shorthands of giving the margin. Let's say if I have to give a margin to only the top side, so I can specify the margin top here. Now you see like the margin is given only to the top side here. If I give it to the margin bottom, is given to the bottom side. Similarly for the right and left. The shorthand of is this, like it includes all the top, left, right, and bottom right. So if I have to give it in a shorthand individually, how could I do that? So it works clockwise, top, right, bottom, and left. So let's say I want to give it a padding of 50 pixel top, 100 pixel right, 50 pixel bottom, and again 100 pixel left. So now you see like here the margin is of 100 pixels and top and bottom is 50 pixels. All right. Similarly goes with the padding, similar way. And the margin can have also like negative values, so that the block can be basically can overlap with any other element if it is in the way, right? Okay. So moving forward with the text formatting. Okay, so text formatting is also crucial. So like if you are designing a website based on some design, have to apply some, some line height, even align your text. So you can do this by text formatting. So let's say for this p tag, I want to give some special styling here. So let's give it a padding of first of all 20 pixels. Okay. So I want to like add some space between every word. I can do that by giving the word spacing. So let's say I give a word spacing of 2 pixels. Okay, so let's do it more so that it is more. Okay, so you can see like every word contains some space, right? Now we have defined it to be the 10 pixel. So you can like adjust it accordingly. Similarly, the line height. Line height is basically used to define the height difference between every line. So that it is defined similar line height of 10 pixels. It basically the by default the line height is actually 16 pixel. So we have reduced it to the 10 pixels. So it is overlapping a bit. So let's give it a line height of 32 pixels. So now you see the difference between the height is according to our requirement, that is 32 pixels of line height, right? Now let's say if I want to align all the text center. So now the text is aligned, right? Similarly, there is also property justify, which makes use of complete available width, and let's reduce. Now it is taking the complete width, right? Similarly, if we want to represent the text as like all the text in the uppercase, so we can make use of the text transform property. These are some value like the capitalize. So the first word of every line is capital. The lowercase, all the words in the paragraph will be smaller, none, the default setting, the uppercase. So let's define the uppercase in this property and see. So now you see like all the words in the paragraph is uppercase converted to the uppercase, right? Similarly, lowercase will put all the characters in the lowercase format. So yeah, like there are multiple various properties that we can use to format our text based on the requirement, right? Okay. Okay, so now moving forward, we have the font formatting. Okay, so this is also a crucial property. Let's say in our design, we have some predefined fonts which we have to implement. So like usually like there are some fonts provided by the Google, Adobe. So there are multiple fonts, and by default like there are some fallback fonts, that is sans serif, monospace. So these are all kinds of font we will be using. So let's say I want to define some fonts. Okay, so first of all we have to import or download. Let's search for the Google fonts. Okay, so one of my favorite font, that is Poppins. Okay, so we want to like there are multiple font weight, like how much weightage you want to give. So let's add the regular one, link tag again to specify the relationship. We have to import it here. Okay, so now it is imported. So let's define some font family here. Okay. Now we see there is a difference in font now. Let's comment this. The default font is displayed in this way, and if we have some external font family, then it is displayed according to that font. So why are we using here like two parameters here, like poppins and serif? Like it is often confused that poppins is of type sans serif or something like that, but sans serif here is behaving as a fallback font. So let's say if for any reason this font is not loaded here in the browser by any reason, like whether there is a network issue or there is an issue in this particular link or any factor, so there is a fallback font that is sans serif. Okay, so that's like we can define even multiple fonts. So let's say let's define another font here. So let's search for unit. Okay, so the previous one, and we have to remove this particular family. Okay, now I have defined unito here, right? And now if you see, font here is Poppins, but I removed it. Maybe it is loading directly from the CDN of Google APIs, but it is basically used for the fallback purposes for any for any reason if your font is not loaded, right? And various font formatting attributes or properties are like font weight, if like how much weight I want to give that particular element. Let's say 500 to make it a bit bold, but it won't work because like the fonts I have faced does not contain any, it just contain the regular. So if I remove this, the default styling will be applied. So as you see, like there is much more weightage in the font here, right? Similarly, like I can put some size. Let's say I have defined a style of 24 pixels, so it will be rendered accordingly. So yeah, we can like text formatting, and the font formatting is useful, right? Okay, so moving forward, list formatting. Similarly, like the list can be formatted based on the types we have. Uh, okay, so let's move forward with the display property. So displays basically, it is the most important property because it controls how our layout should be looking, like how our layout is going to look based on this property. So there are certain default properties which we have talked about, and so which is like the block level elements and the inline elements, but there are different kind of display properties that we can use. So let's use some of them. So we can use it here only. So let's say if I define it, a property of div element is by default block, right? So I can give it a property of inline, so it is going to behave as an inline element. I guess there won't be any much difference, but we have given this padding and margin. So let's remove this and let's put some smaller content here. Okay. So now we see like we can give particular elements default display property and override them by using the CSS, right? And similarly, like we can have uh, flex property, which is basically used to define the container as a flex so that we can make use of the flexbox properties and attributes. Now we are going to talk about the flexbox and media queries so that the responsiveness in the next session we are going to have. And so it does have like a various properties like flex, inline, and the grouping of multiple things. So we have this like inline flex. We have even the grid system here, right? And the table, even the table caption, table cell. So the our element behaves as a table, right? Okay. So moving forward, we have the position. So position property is basically for the positioning the elements based on the value we provided. Okay. So let's create. Okay. So let's remove this and define a. This is relative. Now there are few properties that a position can have, like relative, fixed, even sticky, and maybe absolute. So we are going to talk about it. So we have given this h1 tag the relative position, right? So it will be rendered accordingly, right? Just a relative to the flow, nothing special here, right? Now let's define another property which is having a class of maybe fixed. Let's define the position as fixed. Now in fixed position, we can also define where you want to fix the element. So let's say I want to fix the element to the bottom right basically. So let's see how does it look now. Okay. This h1 tag is fixed. So now you see this tag is fixed. It will be fixed if there is some scroll present, right? So let's put some scroll here. Let's give it a height of maybe 1000 pixels for the testing purpose. So you see, like if I scroll down, this h1 tags is still fixed, right? Okay. Now we can provide the sticky one. Dot sticky. I'm using the Emmet abbreviation here. H1 sticky. Okay. Dot sticky. Top is 0. So now we see like okay, so sticky behaves as relative and fixed both. Like currently it is in the relative manner, but as soon as it hits the viewport, the offset, it is going to be it is going to behave as a fixed element. So if you see, like I am scrolling, still the element is sticky here because it is behaving as a fixed element, right? So like it is most generally used on the sidebars or even in the headers so that it can be sticky, right? Okay, so we can have another property that is, okay, so let's define a div tag for that and a paragraph tag with class absolute. So let's give this position relative and sorry, in this particular thing, div dot container p position absolute. Let's see what is happening here. So as you see, like we have some default styling on the p tag and even on the div tag, right? So let's remove this and let's see. We are not seeing anything. Absolute positioning is relative to its parent. So like if the parent is not having the relative tag, right? So if we remove this, so it will like look for the relative property on the ancestors, on its ancestors. So now if we see, like this is the ancestor, like the body tag is the ancestor, so it is rendered uh, according to that. So the position is shifted according to that. So let's say this container, right, it has a height of maybe 200 pixel width 100%, right? So if I want to the like left 50%, so let's see what this means. So now you see like it is rendered according to the offset we have given it to, like the absolute. The left is set to 50%, like the positioning is 50%, and it is rendered as a absolute element based on its parent element. So let's say if we remove the relative property from here, it is not making any difference because let's say if I give it a position of fixed. Okay, what is happening here? Okay, so it is making certain differences. Okay, so it is considered according to the body tag, right? Okay, so basically the positioning tag, like the absolute property is relative to the is absolute to its relative ancestor. So if this ancestor is going to be relative, then this particular absolute element is going to be rendered according to the offset we have given, which can be left like 50%. I can give some offset from the top, even from the left, or like the bottom. So it can be anything, right? Okay, so moving forward, the Z index. Z index is basically for the stacking purposes. Let's say we have multiple elements. Okay, just a second. So let's code it. Let's say we have this syntax, right? Now, if we want to apply like if just rendered it as it is, so how does it rendered? Now you see like it is rendered in this way according to the stacking purposes. But okay, so let's say if I want to like there are multiple things stacked on one another, and if I want to give it a certain Z index, like which order I want to maintain, like there is an image, there is some text which is being overlaid, and the priority is given to the image tag. Let's say if we have this format, so now the image is here, like, but if the text is being overloaded, let's say image tag has certain property that is absolute, and left is 0, top is 0, no offset, and the opacity of 0.5. So now you see like the image is on top of it, because as we see like the image is on top of it, we can see it. Okay, so let's remove the opacity. Now we can see much better, right? So we can see like the image is on top of it. So how we can like push it to the background so that our text is visible? We can do that by giving the Z index. So I can give this image the Z index of -1. Now you see like it is pushed on the background itself. So we can even like change the opacity so that our text is much more visible, right? So let's give it an opacity of 0.5. So it is rendered accordingly. The opacity is reduced. So the text is much more visible now, right? So these are the few properties like which we can use for the formatting purposes and to create our, to put some styling on our pages and to make it visually better, right? So I guess we have covered all the properties. Opacity is just for increasing and decreasing the transparency basically. So I guess covered all the properties here mentioned, right? So back to home. So I guess all the topics have been covered here. Okay. So any questions if you guys have, you can ask in the comment section. Okay, CSS is very easy. Yeah, it does it. Like it is easy. So if you know about, if you have the prior knowledge, then it is easy definitely. Okay, so rem versus m. So basically all of these are the units which we use, right? Okay, great. So I guess we have covered all the topics which we have to discuss about. So in the upcoming session, we are going to talk about the Flexbox and the responsiveness, how you can create a responsive layout, maybe even creating one. Okay, so projects for yeah, you can like put up any kind of, let's say if you want to create a dummy social media, you can even uh, create that as a beginner. Like you can create any, you know, multiple page applications which may have certain kind of header, navigation links, some content, you know, something like that. Just put any website, even like I have created the simple website right on the locally. You can create similar to that, so that all the properties that I have discussed can be implemented. Use it somewhere so that you can brush up your skills, right? Okay, so I guess we have discussed all the things that we had prepared for this session. So I guess we can wrap this session, I guess. Okay, guys, so hope this session is productive for you guys as well, right? So let's meet in the next session, hopefully next weekend, I guess. Okay, so bye guys, stay safe.